Yeah, I've been using plain old sheets. So.
Carol Hurwitz is the program coordinator of the SSU Holocaust Lecture Series and of the Holocaust Studies Center. She was a registered nurse and a nurse practitioner for almost 20 years before she came to Sonoma State. She's now an MA candidate in international studies, and she has taught courses in the political science department and in women's studies at Sonoma State. Her special interest has been women's experiences in the Holocaust, and she has taught 2 courses on women and the Holocaust, as well as having created and organized the first West Coast Conference on Women and the Holocaust, which took place here in 1987. In March of last year, she organized a conference for Northern California faculty on teaching Holocaust, teaching the Holocaust in universities, colleges, and seminaries. The conference was entitled Facing the Future, Holocaust Education in the 1990s. On a personal note, I would add that for years, Carol has provided invaluable organizational skills and by now, I think, thousands of hours of volunteer time to the making and doing of this Holocaust lecture series. From my perspective, she is one of the 2 most diligent, knowledgeable, generous students and teachers of the Holocaust that I have the honor of knowing. The other one is John Steiner. We owe her a great debt of gratitude, and I look forward very much to her lecture on the destruction of the European Jews and Gypsies. Let's welcome Carol Hurwitz.
Don't take my hand out. Okay, thanks. Thank you, Phil. I have a couple handouts to start with, and I also want to note that I'm very glad to have our resident dog back, whose very appropriate name is Freya, who is a character from Teutonic mythology. I have a handout which has pictures and maps in it, which I will very briefly describe before I start my lecture so that I don't have to refer to it later. This is to give you something to look at while I'm talking, which I find often is, makes things easier. So let me just hand these out. And I also have an outline of my lecture, which you may want to take notes on or not, whichever. The handout on the very beginning page, when you get it, you'll see there's a map of occupied Germany, and we haven't passed out any maps in slides yet this year, and I think it's really important to know what countries we're talking about when we discuss World War II and the Holocaust. And on the map you will see, thanks to William Sotka, who found this for us in the library, you will see that the occupied countries at the end of the war, which was at the height of German occupation, are darkened, relatively darkened, so that you can see the great number of European countries that were overtaken by Germany. And there's a little key on the side that shows different features of World War II at that time. On the second page is an illustration from a fairly recent book called Racial Hygiene by Robert Proctor, a professor at Yale. It's self-explanatory. It shows the attitude of the doctors of the time, the Nazi doctors of the time, Jews, communists, and homosexuals, which is a part of the subject we'll be speaking about today. There are 2 or 3 maps showing gypsy deportations, massacres, and revolts, and then death marches. And there will be 2 or 3 photos of gypsies in there that will give you a little bit of an idea of what gypsies looked like at that time, and then more recently. Then there will be a map of Auschwitz-Birkenau, which shows specifically the gypsy camp, among other areas in in the camp layout. On the very back is a bibliography on genocide, which I put together last year. Most of these books are still some of the best in the field on genocide, both comparative genocide and some of the specific genocides that we have experienced in the 20th century, which there have been many, and there are many going on right now. On the blackboard, I have put 3 texts that are fairly classic for these particular topics. The first one, Raoul Hilberg, is University of Vermont professor of history. He's the preeminent, probably the preeminent historian on the Holocaust at this time, unless someone else comes along. His book is called The Destruction of the European Jews. It's an excellent coverage of that topic, probably right now, that gives a general overview of the topic. The second book, by editors David Crow and John Kolsty, is entitled The Gypsies of Eastern Europe. This is the only book out right now that covers any of the aspects of the Gypsy Holocaust. There's 6 or 8 chapters. They include the experience in Romania, experience of the Sinti Gypsies in Germany, and at this time is one of the only resources, specific aspects of the Gypsy experience in the Holocaust. There's also some current chapters on the abuse and violence they're going through right now, particularly in Romania and Hungary, where whole villages of Gypsies are being burned out, families are being beat up, and some terrible things are going on, which is part of the reason I've taken this on today, because the racial discrimination against them persists to this day. The third book is probably maybe not the best in its field, only one in English, because the best sources are actually in German. This is called The Nazi Doctors, Medical Killing and the Psychology of Genocide. This is about the medicalized killing or euthanasia program, which I will be briefly discussing today too, which was the precursor and test run that the Nazis used before they moved into the camps. And they killed many people in the euthanasia centers. Ethnic German, they started on other populations. Robert J. Lifton is a psychiatrist back east, and he has done probably the only work in this country on that subject. What? Pardon me? I said psychiatrist, didn't I? Psychiatrist. I thought I said psychiatrist. Anyway. If there are not any other questions, I'm going to go ahead with the material. And at the end, we'll be having a short slide presentation. Ilka Hartman, who is one of the other instructors, and I are trying to put together our own collection of related slides for future use, present and future use of faculty in the Holocaust series. And it's by no means complete, but it will give you some interesting perspectives, some slides which may not have been seen in this area before. The topic for my presentation today is Life Unworthy of Life, the Destruction of Europe's Jews and Gypsies. It's given me great sadness to prepare this presentation. This has to be one of the most difficult topics that someone can study. I think the murder of one human being by another is heinous. Then to have to study the mass murder of millions of innocent defended beings by others under a 20th century nation state, it's beyond the human scale of comprehension. On the other hand, for our own safety and the protection of the generations that come, we have a moral obligation to understand thoroughly what has occurred. Another title for this talk could be The 11 Million. The 6 million Jews, nearly 500,000 Gypsies, and other populations selected by the Third Reich for discrimination, abuse, and eventual destruction. The weight of 11 million souls is very heavy. I know that many of you share this burden with me, but it is made heavier by the knowledge that human beings can mistreat each other in these ways. For some of us, there is a personal meaning also. The not distant relatives of my husband and 2 sons were shot in the back of the neck into dugout pits near the eastern cities of Vitebsk and Mogilev. You will read about it in Ordinary Men, 4th book of the readings. Other relatives' remains lie in the great ravine of Babi Yar, outside of Kiev, where over 33,000 Jews and Gypsies were murdered in merely 2 days in late September of 1941. I'm not an expert or authority like Dr. Steiner. I'm a graduate student who would like to make a contribution to the memory of the murdered and to a future where genocide is not an everyday occurrence somewhere on the planet. I make some mistakes. Please note them and we will discuss them later. In any case, Dr. Steiner will tell me about it. Also, my German pronunciation is terrible. Ilka's working on me, but it may be hopeless. I don't know. This material is what my 13-year-old would call pretty gruesome. But I'm not going to show you gory details. I think that all of you have seen enough photos, and in many cases, one image is strong enough to convey the horror and the brutality of the Holocaust. I'm just going to try to describe what happened to those people whose only crime, in most cases, was to be born into one of the groups selected by the Third Reich for extermination. You may become uncomfortable, nervous, disturbed, or depressed. This is natural and healthy to have grief over human suffering. What is not it is to deny that the Holocaust has anything to do with us, or to ignore the critical human issues which arise from our study of it. I want to commend each one of you who, by being present in this lecture series, have demonstrated your personal courage and fortitude not to look away, not to turn away. If you continue to approach the Holocaust, you will find that at times you'll be looking in the mirror. You will also find that facing the Holocaust is one of the most powerful, transformative processes available to us at the end of the second millennium of the Common Era, looking into our 21st century future. I would like to hope that the work that we do here in our hearts, our minds, and souls will enter into a knowledge and a wisdom, perhaps even a kind of sacred wisdom, enabling a more compassionate future for humanity. The second part on the outline is how do we know the facts and evidence of the Holocaust? I think it's important because I've had so many students who think that the main resource for knowing about it is a movie or a TV show. There are thousands of books on the Holocaust at this point. There are 2,000 at least just on Auschwitz. And there are many good films and videos, but awful lot of them are fictionalized and dramatized. It's important to think about the quality of our historical resources. Since first-person or witness accounts are the most accurate form of information we have, these will be very important in the future as those who were present during the Holocaust pass on. Dr. Steiner has enumerated 5 kinds of information he has collected in his research over the years, and I have adapted a bit to include survivor accounts. One form are actual historical documents, both original and copies. The classic example is Raoul Hilberg's railroad schedules of deportation train. He wrote a whole book just about on the subject of how all of the victims of the Holocaust got to the point of killing. Number 2, the source, books, pamphlets, papers, and journals published during the Third Reich, many by Nazi authors. Number 3, historical artifacts, objects, uniforms, so forth. Number 4, autobiographical accounts written by survivors, perpetrators, citizens, and historians of time. Number 5, tapes, interviews, and biographic accounts of persons living through that time. Numerous academics, historians, sociologists, and so forth have added secondary descriptive and interpretive sources to the Holocaust material, but in any case, our primary sources are the people who were there still, and any of the data that we get directly from them. As memory fades and die, those who wish to distort and deny the commonly accepted knowledge of the Holocaust may have an easier task unless we continue to hold high standards of scholarship and historicity. Learning to assess information instead of mere opinions, facts versus ideas, and keeping in mind that television and movies are probably the least accurate and most impressionistic of available media may assist us in remembering and recording the Holocaust honorably. Briefly, I would like to describe a couple of the terms that we use, definitions when we study the Holocaust. The word Holocaust comes from the Greek, means total destruction or consumption by fire. In Greek society, it was actually associated with ritual sacrifice. Shoah is the Hebrew word for the Holocaust. It's preferred by many survivors because it does not inappropriately denote human sacrifice. It's from the Hebrew Bible, where it refers to the destruction of the temple, the spiritual center of Judaism at that time. It was also used to describe the destruction of Jews by burning during the Inquisition. Genocide means to kill or destroy a gene pool, coined by historian Raphael Lemkin in 1944 to describe the loss of his entire family in the Warsaw Ghetto. Most genocides are attempted genocides because they partly succeed in murdering the group they have selected. Entire tribes, ethnic groups, and gene pools are extinct because of genocidal practices throughout history. Autogenocide is the destruction of a selected subgroup within one's own nationality. A good example is the medical euthanasia program under National Socialism, destroying thousands of ethnic Germans deemed unfit to life because of various defined social, psychological, or physical conditions or disabilities. These are all ways of defining or describing what we otherwise call mass killing, mass murder, mass destruction, or crimes against humanity. I take my working definition of genocide from two sources. Irving Hurwitz describes a structural and systematic destruction of innocent people by a state bureaucratic apparatus. Chalk and Jonason in The History and Sociology of Genocide give us, genocide is a form of one-sided mass killing. Think about Bosnia right now and see if this applies. Genocide is a form of one-sided mass killing in which a state or other authority intends to destroy a group as that group and membership in it are defined by the perpetrator. We will be looking closely at the populations specifically targeted by National Socialism for extermination and genocide. And I want to point out that the terms that I will use in this presentation for descriptions such as physical defects or handicapped are no longer used for the most part in our culture. Thankfully, we have terms that imply more honor to the people, and what I will be doing is just what the National Socialists have used in their propaganda. So, who were the 11 million that were murdered? This population is differentiated from the 40 to 50 million other Europeans killed in the war, such as soldiers in uniforms, civilians killed by bombings, etc. The 11 million were specifically selected, identified, and targeted for discrimination, stripping of human and civil rights, separation from society, abuse, incarceration, physical violence, and three groups, the Jews, the Gypsies, and the mentally and physically defective, were selected for medical experimentation, indirect extermination by forced labor, and direct mass killing. Their special treatment, quote unquote, was designed to completely destroy any traces of them in German society or the occupied countries of the Third Reich. I listed 13 groups of people that only selected or that ended up in the camps or in the destruction camps. I liked it because that related to bad luck, 13 groups. But it turns out that since then I've found a couple more since I wrote this up. The primary group obviously were Jews, it's the first group. Second, Gypsies. Third, ethnic Germans in the medical euthanasia program called T4. Fourth group, witnesses. Fifth group, homosexuals, which is what they were called in those days. 6, communists. 7, socialists, and I deliberately distinguished between the two because they did have different programs and agendas and methods. Number 8, labor union leaders. 9, leading feminists and women leaders. 10, resistance and partisans. This included people from all walks of life and almost all of the populations of Europe. Classic ones were Czech resistance, French resistance, Polish resistance. And in this group I included clerics from religious groups because many of them were in resistance movements also, or were arrested because they made statements in public against the regime. The 11th group, Soviet POWs and commissars. 12, Spanish Republicans who had been involved in the Spanish Civil War on the communist side in general. 13, criminals, asocial, and what they called the work-shy people who didn't work enough, according to whose standard. And then the last two that I've been thinking about since, which the movement against them escalated as the war progressed and as the Germans took over more and more of the East, and those were Poles and Slavs. Actually, from the beginning, were also hated by the National Socialists, and they were seen increasingly as possible targets, subhumans, and what they termed fundamentally expendable peoples. We only have estimates at this time on a lot of these groups, including homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Gypsies. But there is a new effort to try to get more data about all these groups because many of us are dying. They're in their 70s or 80s. And if we don't find their stories now and get them recorded and find out the documents of that time that relate to them, we won't have this information. I also want to point out that among the groups that I just listed, who were all designated as undesirables by the National Socialists, many people might have double or triple jeopardy. What if they were, for instance, a socialist who was also a labor leader, who was also a homosexual? For 3 reasons, they might find themselves being discriminated against, incarcerated, put into a concentration camp, or whatever. Life Unworthy of Life, the Action 4 program, T4 program. I selected this title because this was the main phrase used by Hitler, Himmler, and many others to attempt a rationale for the ideology allowing them to organize the medical killing, clinical execution, or euthanasia program, which was the test run for killing other groups. It is a shocking phrase, life unworthy of living, contradictory in essence, and one raising deep and disturbing moral questions about those in medical and legal authority roles and positions holding life and death power over other helpless humans. You may not have realized Nazis killed their own ethnic German disabled first before turning on other groups of victims. This is an amazing travesty of the Hippocratic Oath to heal others, and it became instead a mandate to kill almost at will. A bizarre pseudoscientific racial or biological ideology rose during this time which combined a distorted version of genetics, eugenics, paranoid racism, contamination or pollution by so-called alien or foreign blood, and a desire to separate and destroy those elements of the German or European population which they associated with such alien blood, weakness, defect, or ugliness even. Eugenics was a movement in the 1920s in both Europe and the United States which sought to strengthen and favor superior, so-called superior ethnic or cultural groups and control or stop the production of so-called inferior genes. Other terms for the handicapped or disabled and what should be done with them were coined by the National Socialist leaders and the doctors who were attracted to the new movement. Some of the words were extermination, a term we reserved for insects in general, unfit for life, incurables, persons needing the right to die, and persons needing merciful death. Doctors joined the Nazi Party in number of any profession, 45%. Quite a few were in the SS. A sophisticated propaganda system with movies about mercy killing, medical personnel in white coats reassuring they knew best, and public statements designed to prepare the population for the program was undertaken. Categories of people listed as needing mercy killing were, this is a long list, so hang on, epileptics, paralytics, cerebral palsy, the blind and deaf, hair lips and club-footed, mongoloid and retarded. I'm a nurse, so, these details are interesting to me. Schizophrenics, depressive, all birth defects, all types of physical disability or unusual features, anyone in a mental or physical care facility 5 years or more, racially undesirable children, which in this case meant blacks, Jews, Gypsies, or Poles, the ill, including tuberculars, among others. Isn't this an unbelievable list? T4 stands for Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, the address of the Reich Administrative Center for the program. In September 1939, an order signed by Hitler started the killing process designed to decrease the excessive numbers of institutionalized persons, free up food and other resources, healthy persons, and the war effort, I might add, get rid of so-called unuseful eaters, and begin the, this term is unbelievable, easing of the already begun struggle with death of these poor creatures. The cynicism and indifference is amazing. An actual death aid law was written but not passed. It stayed in a drawer and did not get put through. It was unnecessary, actually, as the whole program went forward, efficiency and enthusiasm without any legal backing. The victims were killed by being deliberately starved to death over time in clinics, hospitals, and cure centers, as they called them, with overdoses of powdered sleeping pills. Luminol was a common product. At nap time or nighttime, with injections of chemicals, phenol was commonly used. And finally, in small carbon gas chambers, especially designed at these same centers, which looked like villas and castles. Part of the deception. They were beautiful buildings in rural, sometimes rural settings that looked very, very inviting. Their bodies and clothes were burned in small crematoria at the same facilities, and their ashes and a letter of explanation that they had died of pneumonia, stroke, flu, or heart attack was sent to the relatives. There were 6 major centers. The names might not mean anything to us, but they probably do to Ilka or Dr. Steiner. Hadamar, Schloss Hartheim, Sonnenstein, Brandenburg, Bernburg, and Grafeneck, names now infamous in history, plus some smaller clinics where smaller numbers were annihilated. Over the period of 1938 to 41, these cure centers, as they called them, quietly and secretly destroyed approximately 80,000 men, women, and children. Growing opposition led by churches forced the program underground, where it continued more secretly and on a smaller scale. The uniquely trained personnel moved on to larger projects, such as building the gas chambers at death camps. Christian Wirth, SS Major, while in charge later of 3 death camps, was still paid by T4. Engineer Brock moved from designing gas chamber to Auschwitz. An important precedent was set by the success of this killing program. The regime was primed for more. The next part is the destruction of the Jews, and I've subtitled 12 Years of Horror. The largest numbers of those destroyed, between 5 and 6 million, were European Jews. The number may be revised with the new archival resources in Eastern Europe and the CIS, or the Commonwealth of Independent States, which the Soviet Union is called now. 2 out of every 3 Jews remaining in Europe from 1938 were murdered. 6 million of a world population of 18. If we took 3 Jews in Europe before the Holocaust, 1 would escape out of the country, 1 would be murdered, and 1 would survive hiding or a concentration camp, just to be approximate if you're trying to think of the numbers, because when you're in the millions, it gets confusing. If we examine the process by which the National Socialists achieved their goals of cleansing their so-called Aryan race of its undesirable elements, Jews, Gypsies, and lives not worth living, we can see a pattern. Raoul Hilberg, who I've mentioned before, has characterized this in 3 main steps, and Dr. Steiner next week has elaborated this into a much longer and more if he chooses to speak about that. But the 3 main steps are definition. This is definition of the victims. Who are they? Identifying them, labeling them, separating them from the rest of the population. So number 1 is definition. Number 2 is concentration. Concentrating them all in one place so we know exactly where they all are. Number 3 is annihilation, or destruction. It's a very way of imagining what almost all genocidal societies do in order to capture the selected groups which they choose to try to kill. A more complete pattern, which would take 7 steps, might add the following, and you don't have to write it down, it's a little longer. It would be definition, legislation, which are the laws that support the actions that the state is taking, expression of properties and belongings of the people, concentration into ghettos or camps or areas, and that includes separation and isolation from the rest of the population, annihilation, and in the case of the Nazis, also confiscation of all the belongings of the people which they have destroyed. The Jews were defined as racially inferior and impure by the Nuremberg racial purity laws in 1935. Other laws had already dismissed them from jobs in civil service and stripped them of citizenship. Legislative measures barred them from public schools, public places, and most professions. They were identified as Jews and singled out for abuse starting particularly on Kristallnacht, November 9th and 10th, 1938. On those 2 days and nights, hundreds of businesses were destroyed, nearly 100 Jewish persons murdered, thousands wounded, numerous synagogues were destroyed. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to Dachau, which, by the way, had already been built in 1933. Jewish businesses and properties began to be expropriated or Aryanized, as they called it. In 1938, it was decreed that all Jewish passports must be marked with a red J and middle names of Sarah and Israel required for women and men, respectively. The yellow star was to be worn by all Jews so they could be easily identified. They were increasingly ostracized, separated, and isolated from German society. They soon were forced onto train transports for which they had to pay themselves one-way passage, and then concentrated in Polish Jewish urban ghettos where they were either starved to death, marched, or deported to the slave labor camps or straight to the gas chambers at one of the death camps. All of their belongings, even jewelry, gold fillings, and hair, were confiscated. So the final solution, how did they kill 6 million Jews in 3 years? And I use 3 years because the greater part of them were killed between 1941 and 1944. Smaller numbers were killed up until that time, and then people were still dying in concentration and death camps in 45, but the greater majority of them had already been destroyed. And then, of course, some kept dying after they were so malnourished, diseased, or depleted that they could not survive, even though they were liberated. We tend to think mostly of the Jewish fate when we refer to the Holocaust. That's because it was the largest group and most thoroughly, systematically, massively hunted down and murdered in every country of Europe. They were killed by hanging, beating, starving, torture, drowning, burning, medical experiments, but especially by shooting and gassing. The first method that was used for large-scale destruction was something called the Einsatzgruppe, in which were 4 details of murder squads sent out from Germany, and which at some point included Ukrainian and other people, collaborators with them in certain areas to complete their mission. In the summer of 1941, in conjunction with an invasion of Russia, these 4 groups of armed men, Einsatzgruppen A, B, C, and D, swept through the Baltics, Poland, White Russia, which was called at that time as now Belarus, the Ukraine, and Galicia, gathering the Jews, Gypsies, and mentally ill of every city, town, and village, and murdering them in cold blood. The Jews were often forced to dig their own burial pits into which they were piled. Sometimes the bodies were buried or burned not. Belongings and properties were confiscated. Whole families and villages have disappeared forever. An estimated 500,000 died this way just in 1941 and 42. A few Jews and a few Gypsies escaped into the forests across the Volga River or joined the Soviet partisans and managed to survive. There were many resistance attempts all through these areas. Most of them were small. They had few arms. There were some in the ghettos. I don't have time to go into that subject. It's a subject of its own to discuss the resistance, the Jewish resistance and non-Jewish in Europe. The second major event that happened to these people was the first deportations and transports to Auschwitz were from France in 1942. But from 41 to 45, the Nazis and their collaborators planned and organized literally thousands of train transports to every country in Europe, no matter how distant, to the eastern ghettos, concentration and death camps. They would appear suddenly, order all Jews to a central location, load them on trains, which would carry them generally without food or water, directly to the ghettos or camps. Many died en route, particularly children, the elderly, and ill. For instance, 30 deportations in 2 weeks from October 1942 carried all the Jews, 5 villages in central Poland, straight to Treblinka death camp. For instance, 65 transports from the Białystok region on one day in November 1942 emptied 20 towns with an average population of 2,000 Jewish people. It's beyond belief how they managed this, but they did. The countries of deportation where Jews deported from and therefore ended up in with these nationalities in the concentration and death camps included, hang on, Germany, Poland, Austria, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Greece, Yugoslavia, Mediterranean islands, White Russia, Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Holland, Norway, Czechoslovakia, Finland, Salonika, Italy, Rhodes, Crete, Turkey, the Crimea, Algeria, Morocco, Corfu, Albania, and the Balkans. I would say they were thorough. By accident, also, they were from Jews from South America, Central America, the Caribbean, the United Kingdom, the United States, Palestine, and Switzerland, who had either come to visit relatives or had resettled in their old age or whatever. Paris was a common place for these Jews from other countries where they should have been safe and should have been rescued, but were not, where they were caught up in and sent to camps. 14 from the United States is what I have found so far from all over the eastern side of the United States, and I may have missed a couple of countries. Do you think I have? The ghettos were the third process. The majority of Europe's Jews lived in Poland, the Ukraine, White Russia, and Eastern Europe. 3 million lived in Poland alone, where they had thrived, relatively speaking, since the 5th century. The Nazis and their helpers collected them and transported them, except the many that they killed immediately, to the 6 largest cities, which then became the Holocaust ghettos. These were Warsaw, Krakow, Lodz, Lvov, Vilna, and Kovno. The first 4 are in Poland. The last 2 were in Lithuania. A 7th was smaller and a story of its own, Theresienstadt outside of Prague, Czechoslovakia. I won't go into that one. That's Dr. Steiner's story. He was in that camp, that ghetto and camp. The Jews were herded into old, crowded, barricaded areas of these cities. They were not allowed to leave. They were given less and less food and resources and slowly starved to death. Over 31,000 people starved to death alone in the last 6 months of 1942 in the Warsaw Ghetto. Regular transports left for the killing centers. Some stronger persons were selected for slave labor details. Without nourishment or medical resources, they slowly starved and died of a variety of diseases, which included typhus, tuberculosis, pneumonia, dysentery, and a host of others. The ghettos were soon emptied and destroyed. The concentration and slave labor camps were the next step for a number of these people. There were hundreds of camps all over Germany and the occupied countries. We have a wonderful, shouldn't say wonderful, terrible map of Germany, Poland, and countries that includes literally hundreds of the camps. These were mostly concentration camps, detention camps, slave labor camps, POW camps. Dr. Steiner is really the authority on those kind of camps. The conditions varied from poor to horrific. Inmates were fed little, had little access to medical care, and often had back-breaking labor under harsh conditions in every kind of weather. Most camps provided labor for the war effort. Centrifugal missiles and rockets at Nordhausen, weapons parts at Plaxau, Schindler's place. It was supposed to be making weapons parts anyway. Inmates built roads, railroads, buildings, their own barracks, their own gas chambers and crematoria, latrines, etc. The destruction camps were the 5th step, and or killing centers, as some people call them. And there's a map. Is there a map in there? I guess it's going to be in the slides. That has the 5 main death camps. Auschwitz, obviously, the largest, and the largest number of people died there. Belzec, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Majdanek. They were all in Poland, and they were all within about 400 miles of each other. in a sort of square area in the east central part. And these pictures of Majdanek might give you some idea. There are several probably qualify almost as killing centers because even though they were basically slave labor camps, so many people died there from the harsh conditions. And they had actual killing operations there, like gas chambers or small gas chambers that, there were actually more, but the 5 big ones are the important ones. Mauthausen had a rock quarry, and thousands of people died from just the sheer difficulty of the work, where they had to climb up and down carriages. Chełmno in northern Poland was the very first place where Jews and Gypsies were gassed at the very beginning, and before the larger camps were built, and it was done in trucks, which had carbon monoxide gas coming through the back of it, and the people would be loaded into the truck, driven into the truck would drive around, and by the time it stopped, they were all dead. You've seen in the movies, in Schindler's List or wherever, the scenario for people who arrived on the ramp at one of these death camps. Often they had no idea where they were. They had ridden for hours and days in often closed boxcars or even open ones, open to the elements. Upon arrival, the victims' left belongings on the ramp were shaved, stripped, went through the selection process, driven to the gas chamber disguised as a shower, gassed, then their bodies were removed by Sonderkommandos who transported the bodies to the crematorium. Ashes were removed later. Belongings were all collected, sorted, and returned to Germany in many cases, all in a few hours. The sorting wasn't all in a few hours, but the whole killing process was. The immediate fate was obvious for children under 14 or who couldn't prove themselves larger or youth. Babies, pregnant women were killed immediately because they were carrying babies. And parents who stayed with their children or their elderly would not be selected and so would die. And obviously the ill and the weak would be immediately selected to die. Those selected to remain alive lived in barracks under unbelievable conditions of filth, hunger, deprivation, terror, and brutality. Camp life devolved, that word on purpose, another world of its own with a hierarchy of inmates and range of behaviors necessary for survival. Dr. Steiner's writings or Terence Dupre's The Survivor, Primo Levi's writings, they give you a quite accurate perspective on what it was like in these places. The last method, and kind of almost maybe an unplanned sequela of the rest of the plan for the final solution, were the death marches. And these actually happened all through the Holocaust, where people were marched from one camp to another, or from a railroad line to a camp or whatever. They were marched miles without food, water, warm clothing, or shelter. But the number of death marches escalated, obviously, in the last year or two of the war, because as the Allied forces moved in and the occupiers shrank, the Germans moved the inmates of their camps closer in to central areas and central death and concentration camps, so that one of the things, the maps you will see in the handout that I gave you, shows just a few of the death marches that occurred in the last months of 1945. And huge numbers of people died on these death marches because they were already so deep, and many of them happened in the winter of 44 and into the spring of 45, so that they were marching in snow. Dr. Steiner's, one of his stories on the account is about his death march and what happened to him on that. The purpose was to kill more inmates, evade the Soviets, and then probably to hide evidence, because they were evacuating camps that showed incredible grief and horror, and perhaps they even were beginning to feel nervous that they were going to have to account for their actions. There's one amazing account of a 42-day march of 1,000 Jewish women from a little camp. Let's see if I can remember the name of it. Oh, I've got it here. New Salts. Have you ever heard of that? New Salts. They were marched to Flossenburg. which is a more well-known. There were 1,000 of them when they started. It took 42 days, and there were 200 left when they got there. It gives you some kind of an idea. Okay, the last group that I'm going to talk about, besides the T4 unfortunates and the Jewish people, are the Gypsies. And right now we call this the silent Holocaust, or invisible or forgotten Holocaust, because being an oral history people, all their history is carried in an oral form in their matriarchal sages of their tribes. They are not, many of them are literate at this point, but historically they have not been, and so a lot of their story has not been written. And the Encyclopedia of the Holocaust has something like 3.5 pages out of 3,000 pages on the Holocaust. So there's a real sense that we have to start recording their story before their survivors also die. And the even more tragic part of it is that they are now, and have been really for 1,000 years, the scapegoats, in addition to the Jews or any other people of color in Europe. Not that Jews are people of color, but people of color are also included, like the Turks at this point in time are also discriminated against in Europe, have been mistreated for over 1,000 years. And the discrimination continues to this day, and as I mentioned previously, Romania and Hungary right now are burning them out of their homes, beating them up, stabbing them. 3 men were killed in Poland not too long ago because one of the men accidentally hit a Polish child who did not die but was injured with his car, and so a crowd immediately gathered and killed them. I don't know if there were any convictions or whatever in the case. It just is an example to show that they're still not taken care of in terms of human and civil rights yet in most of Europe. And some of you may not know, but some of the neo-Nazi attacks that people presumed were against Turks were also against Gypsies. In northern Germany, for instance, a couple of the attacks were Gypsies that were with Turks because they had some cultural things that were going on or whatever, and they were attacked. Certainly a Roma historian, that's what they prefer to be called, most of them, Roma, except for the German Gypsies who are Sinti. A Roma historian should be giving this presentation. That would be the most authentic, but unfortunately there are only about 6 of them in the world, and none of them are in the West Coast of the United States. So someone needs to tell this, and so I've decided to try, with you realizing that my resources are limited and my experience is far and distant from Gypsy culture. They are one of the most fascinating ethnic and cultural groups in Europe. Since their arrival around 1000, they've been treated with a profound ambivalence. Romanticism, curiosity, and fascination on one hand for their free-spirited life, and hatred, fear, suspicion, and abuse on the other. The first written accounts of them in the 13th century coincide with numerous laws and edicts circumscribing their behavior, whereabouts, and limiting their human and civil rights. They have been hunted like foxes in Scotland and Germany, beaten, whipped, jailed, drowned, burned, worked to death, starved to death, drawn and quartered, France, and unique to any European people, have been branded cattle. Mostly women and children were treated this way and enslaved in chains. Hungary, during the peasant feudal society, used gypsies as chained slaves. The rape of a gypsy woman or the murder of a gypsy man, woman, or child historically has not been considered a serious offense. And even today, there isn't much criminal punishment involved with discriminating against gypsies in Europe. Their human rights are at risk even today, particularly in Eastern Europe. Their mythology and linguistic base is Hindu and Vedantic. Their oral history carried by matriarchal sages. They have strong family ties and traditions and were known throughout Europe as musicians and dancers, jewelers and craftspersons, basket makers, peddlers, circus performers, bats, which some of you may have seen, to name a few of their unique accomplishments. The National Socialists preferred not to see gypsies as human beings, but another form of subhumans to be worked to death or destroyed. Even though the Nazis acknowledged pure Gypsies as the true Aryans, originating in northern India, they are the true Aryan tribe, if you want to look at it anthropologically. They were afraid of being contaminated. The Germans were afraid of being contaminated by so-called impure races. In their first policies in 1933, as soon as they took office, they planned for the separation and isolation, massive sterilization, and forced labor of all Gypsies. Not until 1942 and the Wannsee Conference and the transfer of the Gypsy problem to Himmler's SS jurisdiction, though, was total extermination planned for them. A comprehensive law was never written or passed against them, but the following policies and ideological statements provided for the program against them. And I'll be very brief, but the first, a Center for Registering Gypsies as Criminals in a special Gypsy Affairs unit of the Munich Police was in 1899. Regular biological hereditary examinations were performed on them in the 30s under the auspices of proving them a different race, and this was done by social welfare agencies who ostensibly were supposed to be helping them. In 1906, the Reich Interior Ministry issued guidelines for fighting the Gypsy plague. And in 1937, Himmler ordered the Reich Center for Fighting the Gypsy Menace to draft racial definitions for Gypsies so that they could be detained and incarcerated. After 1933, their fate was similar to the Jews. What civil rights they had were withdrawn. They were singled out for abuse, herded together into detention, concentration, and work camps. Thousands were shot by the Einsatz group in the towns and forests of Poland, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and Galicia, the area where the largest population of them resided or migrated through. They were even less likely to be rescued or assisted by townspeople because of their historic reserve and mistrust towards non-Gypsies because they had been so thoroughly abused. The Sinti, or German-based Gypsies, many of whom had been settled in, as they call it. There's the settled in ones, and then there's others, kind of two basic types. In Germany for 300 or 400 years, were not attacked for the most part until 1942 because they were more accepted as middle-class Germans in some cases. But by 42, the Reich had decided to kill them all. So Sinti, Roma, and Laleri, which are the Middle Eastern or Portuguese, Spanish groups in all Spanish-speaking, all countries of Europe were deported and transported, often in their own boxcars behind the Jews, to the slave labor camps, even to special Gypsy sections of the Jewish ghetto. For instance, the Warsaw Ghetto had a whole area that was just for Gypsies until they were transported. Eventually, almost all were shipped to death camps. The special treatment, and we always use that with quotes because that was one of the terms that was used regularly by the National Socialists. The special treatment Gypsies included the following: castration and sterilization experiments, saltwater drinking experiments on Gypsy children, eye experiments, and twin experiments on Gypsy children. They were favorites of Mengeles. X-ray experiments on Gypsy women, wound healing experiments by the medical unit at Ravensbrück, so those were all young Gypsy girls, pre-adolescent mostly. They wanted nice, healthy legs. Experiment on, and being forced to play in Gypsy orchestras at Auschwitz and also in Romania before being murdered or gassed. Ideological terms and euphemisms used by the National Socialists for Gypsies included vermin, pests, scum, dangerous foreign blood, filth, dead weight within humanity, worthless life, hopelessly criminal, and called for them to be rendered criminally harmless, biologically futureless, and to be put out of their misery. In the camps, they were marked with a Z for Zigeuner, or sometimes a black triangle to be included with the asocials. Concentration camps with significant numbers of Gypsies included Sachsenhausen, Gross-Rosen, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Sobibor, Simon, Medanich, and Ravensbrück Women's Camp. Largest numbers died or were murdered at Mauthausen, Sobibor, Belzec, and Auschwitz. Many were gassed with Jews in the Chelmno mobile gassing trucks. And the hot summer night, some of you may have read this in Elie Wiesel's book called Night. The hot summer night in 1944, when the last Gypsies at Auschwitz were gassed, is known as Zigeuner Nacht, or Night of the Gypsies. The total number of gypsies is unknown. Right now, several scholars are working on the documents and data, and a new research project has been started at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial. The estimation is between 1/2 and 3/4 million total. Scholars think that perhaps 75% of the gypsy population of Europe was destroyed, even higher than any other proportion of a population. Simon Wiesenthal is actually one of this. He thinks it's higher. He thinks it's 80%. One old French gypsy woman survivor at Ravensbrück, who had been picked up by police in a French carnival where she had worked with her family. Her entire family of 14 had been murdered already, and she asked French resistance survivor Germaine Tillion, why? What did we do? We don't know the answer that Tillion gave. There is no answer but to work for a better life for these people who experienced more violence and abuse than is imaginable, who still have no homeland or safe refuge, who remain vulnerable to the vagaries of neo-Nazism, nationalism, racism, and prejudice everywhere they travel in the world, which by my last research looked to be about 66 countries and republics. The silent gypsy Holocaust has a voice now. Children of gypsy survivors are beginning to ask questions and become activists for their families. For instance, the International Romani Union, the head of it is a fellow named Romani Rose, and his parents were both Holocaust survivors. So he's taken a very active role. The Holocaust Memorial finally has one gypsy representative after trying for several years to have his people represented on this council. Gypsies are still not allowed to war reparations for their camp experiences and for their losses in most of Europe, and many of them had no documentation, so they can't prove much. But that's beginning to change. A story is told of one gypsy survivor who returned to her native Frankfurt to receive her reparations physical examination, only to find that the doctor who was to examine her was the same one who had sterilized her in the Holocaust. Sad stories need to come to an end. We need to be taking better care of the minority populations of our country so that these things don't happen. More of us know now and care and are willing to do something to help. Ilka, for instance, will tell us when we do the slideshow about one of the groups from her city, Hamburg, who have worked extensively with the gypsies, survivors and their families in Europe and Germany. One local note I want to think about, the California State Board of Education in 1988, right here in our own state, voted not to include information on the Gypsy Holocaust in the model curriculum on genocide and human rights. So there are sometimes ways that we are also a bit responsible for the information not getting out. I think we'll do the slideshow now, and then after that, I have a few questions, and then we can have some questions. Any questions right now? It's a pretty difficult subject. Not too cheery, but I think it's one that needs to be told. So, did you have a question? No. Bill had already shared talking about the slides, and also Louise Albert asked Dr. Snyder. Okay, this is a poster in April of 1938 about Anschluss with Austria, and it shows the progression from the country. We'll have it in English in the next slide, so don't worry. This is just a German version which shows you the Eagle and the swastika, and now all of you know Ja is yes. So the idea is that everyone agrees. Isn't this great? So here we are with the English translation. Step by step, Adolf Hitler is tearing apart the dictated Treaty of Versailles. 1933, Germany leaves the League of Nations at Versailles. 1934, reconstruction of the Wehrmacht, the Navy, and the Luftwaffe begin. 1935, I don't know how to say that word, Saarland, brought back home, armed power of the Reich. 1936, the Rhineland completely liberated. 1937, the myth of war guilt, which Dr. Parnas talked about some in her lectures, ceremoniously extinguished. 1938, Germany and Austria united in the Reich. Greater Germany achieved. Throughout the whole of Germany will acknowledge their liberator on 10th April. Adolf Hitler. All say yes. Next. This fellow is Hans Fischer, and he was a so-called anthropologist. I say that because he got diverted into what we call racial anthropology, which is off the point of science, but this was a part of the thinking of the National Socialists. He went to Africa and studied people who intermarried with Boers, and then made the brilliant deduction that all cultures who married into what he called inferior races, or people of color, were culturally and intellectually inferior from that time on. So this is one of the very poor scientists, we could say, who contributed his ideology to National Socialist medicine and helped set up in Berlin an institute which studied anybody of color, mixed color, as inferior, and caused a lot of problems, obviously, from his poor thinking of science. Next. This is a German doctor's journal published in 1933, and shows that on this side, where 45% of German doctors became members of Nazi Party, 26% of the doctors were also members of the SA, and 7.3% belonged to the SS. The doctors were by far the profession with the highest percentage of Nazis. This is a nurse, and she looks quite young to me, who killed patients and received regular bonuses for doing so. If I remember right, she was mostly giving injections in one of those so-called cure centers. On the left is a young woman who was murdered with an overdose of sleeping pills, presumably because of extended psychological disturbance. On the right is a 19-year-old woman who was admitted to a mental hospital in Berlin, and after a controversial diagnosis, they decided she was schizophrenic and forced her to be sterilized. And when she wished to marry, she was prohibited from doing so. Here's a list, a document of a particular hospital. I don't know this one, but it's Mulfingen, St. Joseph's of Mulfingen, and it has 40 people on here. We could figure out their ages on the right if we get this is roughly their birth dates. And the dates on are when they came to this facility. If you will look, you will see 4 tiny asterisks after the first name here. Those are the people who survived from one of these cure centers. The other ones were all murdered. Just to give you some of the names and ages. It doesn't give us diagnoses, but it documents lists of people that they found unworthy to live. Next.
They were children.
What?
They were children.
Yes, children in a children's facility. Excuse me, I should have said that. These are the doctors, Nazi doctors at the Nuremberg trials. And I haven't had time to study the cases to see, I believe some were hanged, some were executed, some did prison terms, and then some went free. But this is to give you an idea of what some of these men look like, and that there were consequences. Elka, why don't you do this one?
This is a board game, and it's in old German script. It says Jews out, away with Jews, and then on the bottom it says onward to Palestine. But the text in very small writing, the one that we can read, says, it's really awful, it says, show in the dice game that you can show your ability in the dice game that you may gather many Jews. And on the other side, as I remember, it says again something like show your ability to which indicates that you will be the victor if you play this game well.
So this is an example of anti-Semitic game which encouraged people to try to overcome Jews. The caption, this is a little blurry, but it shows many, many men, all male Jews from the city and district of Baden-Baden were rounded and marched under SS guard from the police headquarters to the railroad station and then deported to Dachau. This was in 1938. So this is on that second day of Kristallnacht, which I was talking about. If you can imagine all the Jewish men basically in this town being arrested at one time, that meant that all these households had no father, no husband, no meal provider. In those days, that was even more significant. Okay. This is a little jerky because we don't have all of our slides yet, but this is in the Warsaw Ghetto, and this little girl is selling armbands with a Star of David for sale. This picture is pretty classic. It's being used in a lot of Holocausts, but it's a police roundup in a ghetto in Poland. Probably Warsaw, but I'm not positive. Is it Warsaw? Yeah. And you can see the mother and her two children there, and the guard on the right, and all these people being rounded up. Okay. This is a slide of the Einsatzgruppen, which we talked about, out from the Third Reich into the Eastern Front, simultaneously with the attack on Russia. And you can see the four main bands of the A, B, C, and D group, the A being up in the Baltics, in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, where they killed almost all the Jews, and then coming down through Belarus, Ukraine, and then down into Galicia. Eventually they came all the way down into the Crimea. So they fanned out, even though right now it just looks like four areas, they fanned out the whole area. And the two towns that I mentioned, cities that I mentioned where my husband's family were from, Vitebsk and Mogilev, which are on the right top side up there, but it's kind of fuzzy. It's kind of hard to see. Here are the main killing centers, which you can see Chelmno up there at the top, where the fans were, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek, Belzec, and Auschwitz. And you can see they're all not very far from each other in the central area there, where millions of people were murdered. This is a diagram of some of the triangle markings that were used in concentration camps, and marking the different inmates. You can see the different categories. There's political, Bible readers, and ecclesiastics, which would probably be mostly Jehovah's Witnesses, but were other clerics also, and other people who, for religious reasons, opposed the Third Reich. Immigrants, I wasn't sure what that meant. Is that Poles and Slavs? Do you know what immigrants from where to where? Dr. Steiner, can you add? Do you know what the blue immigrants would be? Is that what it is? Poles and Slavs. The asocials, which included prostitutes and people who were doing black market business and so forth, and then common criminals, which at one point most of the criminals, or many of the criminals in the jails, were released to the concentration camps because they were not considered worth saving. And then you see the homosexuals with the pink. So we try to differentiate between the lavender, which is very pale, and then the pink, which was the homosexuals. Then the middle category, markings worn by Jews up until the first half of 1944 included the yellow part imposed on the other triangle, and then it's simplified according, at least to this particular classification. Markings worn by Jews from the second half of the 1944, the star has been simplified to a bar, and a stripe, that sometimes went, or a bar that went around the arm. And then down at the bottom we have special markings, obviously your camp number, if you were in a camp long enough to get one tattooed on your arm. Polish nationality is P, French F. There were others too. In penal company has this little dot at the bottom. Recommitted to camp meant you were a high security risk because you had tried to escape. And these last three are related to that in terms of high security because you were suspected of either trying to escape or do something not allowed. Also, not on here, but Z was the classification for gypsies, as we said before, and then sometimes they had black, also black triangle, because they were considered asocial. They didn't work at regular jobs, and they were sometimes considered criminals too, although most of it was petty crime compared to the heavier crimes. Okay. These two charts refer to Jewish statistics, even though it's not marked that way, and the depths by country at the top show approximate numbers. I believe this is from Hilberg, and this show at the lower end of estimates, which is 5,100,000, so that you see some of the countries, and I mentioned even more countries than that, but these are the major countries, I guess, that would be contributing Jews who were killed. And then the deaths by year show, what I had already discussed, was that between 1941 and 44 was when the number were killed, and obviously 41 and 42 are the big ones. 42 is the all-time high year. Deaths by cause, this just generally reviews what I talked about. Causes being ghettoization and privation, and you get many up there at the top in the different ghettos, and then the open-air shootings by the Einsatzgruppen. And there's some interesting statistics here about Serbia and Croatia and Bosnia. I'm not going to go into the story, but on your maps, your handouts, I included the killing of the Jews in Bosnia. The same camps that were in World War II are the ones, in some cases, that the Serbs and Croats have been keeping the Bosnians in. Some of the mass rape camps, for instance, are the same places as in World War II. So history repeats itself in some cases. You have the camps, the main death camps there, and then concentration camps, and then they have 3 camps here that are concentration camps but with killing operations. And then they have Romanian and Croatian numbers separately because in those countries there's special treatments done where they actually killed populations by slitting their throats and other special things that they thought up there in Eastern Europe for their Jewish populations, and which need to be studied and really haven't been studied adequately. More instances of brutality which we have to learn about at some point. I guess that's all. Here is a different illustration for the countries where Jews were killed, and to show the difference between survival rates in certain countries. And you see the huge number of Polish Jews, for instance, and such a high proportion of them destroyed. And even some of the small places, almost all of the Jews are destroyed. But fortunately, there were countries, say France, where killed and deported is only a percentage of the total, because many were able to flee down into, over to Switzerland, down into Italy, into Spain and Portugal, or whatever, in time. So you see some interesting, let's see, Holland lost actually a large proportion, even though it was a relatively resistant country. And then Denmark is one of the countries, almost all of its Jews, by transporting them across the channel to Sweden. That's a famous and wonderful rescue story. And then Bulgaria stands out in Eastern Europe as the only country that did not give up its Jews to the occupying forces. So quite a few were saved there. Hungary, even though they cooperated with the Germans. The Hungarians were transported so late in the process because they were kind of way down there in Eastern Europe, and the Germans just didn't get to it in time, so that that was the largest population of Jews left in Eastern Europe, and to this day is the largest thriving Jewish center in Eastern Europe is Budapest in Hungary. It's one of the only places where you can find Jewish life. Their picture was taken by, what is her name, Margaret Bourke-White, right? Did I say it right, Ilka? Bourke-White, who was an American journalist photographer who went to went over to Europe slightly right before the war was over and during liberation. And these were Gypsy children. We don't know if they survived or not. We have no idea. Yes.
This was a group of Gypsy children of which we don't know at all.
Mm-hmm.
They were not taken by her.
Oh, I'm sorry.
These are the pictures that were found, and I think they belong to a group of gypsies about whom a German scientist is trying to find out the fate by the Society for Certain People in Germany. The pictures by Margaret Bourke-White are later.
Next, I guess. Gypsy boy. Two kids. This one we do know. You want to translate, Ilka?
Yeah, the sisters Patricia and Wilhelm Georges are two of five siblings who were deported to Auschwitz on May 9 in 1944. Their ages were 19. Only the 17-year-old of the group of five, Rosa Georges, survived.
Okay, I think you were going to explain this one too. Yeah.
This is a picture of a young gypsy girl, a historical girl. Her name was Erna Thurmann, and a children's book was written about her in Germany in recent years. The book is called Ede and Unku, written by Alex Belling, and the little girl, the main character of the story is Unku, and she died in Auschwitz. That is the present-day children's story that was written about her life in Germany.
This is obvious. This is the liberation at Dachau. These people look relatively well-fed. I think they're the ones that could make it to the gate, probably, because there are plenty of others who could not. Oh, let's go back to the boy. The little boy. This little boy was liberated, 1940. We don't know what happened to him, and we took this slide as an example of a child who made it, we think. No, for sure.
These are the pictures taken by the American
Okay.
at the very end of the liberation.
This, we believe, is either Buchenwald or Bergen-Belsen. I think Buchenwald. And the caption that goes with it is how many of them will survive the night, particularly this boy on the right, because even though they've been liberated, he probably will not make it because he's so sick and so starved. So thousands died after liberation. This is a slide of the survivors. This refers to Jews, and it shows some of the countries and places that they left and went to. A majority of them would not want to stay in Europe. And in fact, almost 1,000 people, Jews, were killed in Poland between 45 and 47 when they went back to their villages and tried to find their previous lives, families, and homes. And there was a particular massacre in this town, Kielce, is that how you say it? Kielce, right in the center of Poland there, where 41 people were killed when they came back and tried to claim their property there. And so the idea was to leave Europe because even after the war, they were not really welcome. So in many places. So you see the largest number went to Palestine and the second largest went to United States. These are Roma in Hungary. And this is a current photo, which is very interesting because it looks also historical. It looks like traveling Roma have always looked, although the earlier caravans would have been, wouldn't have had modern wheels on them. Want to explain this?
Yeah, these are the Gypsies as a monument for the concentration camps where so many of the people died. This was the current photograph. And that's 1980s, that was taken, I think.
Yes, and there have been a number of Gypsy survivor protests and hunger strikes to try to raise attention to their plight and to allow them to get reparations for what they lost and to bring world attention to their needs at this point in time. So things are looking up, but it's still very difficult for them. I think that's it on the slides. Could somebody turn the lights on? Yeah, okay. I just have a few conclusions and then if there's any other questions. I've attempted to give an overview of the primary victims of the Holocaust rationale provided for their selection and destruction. It remains for the speakers to follow in this lecture series and for you in your discussion sections to delve deeper into how and why this could happen. What occurred seems monstrous and unforgivable and outside of the human pale, outside of our understanding of each other as humans. Certainly we imagine ourselves as far removed from such acts and roles and behaviors. That remains to be seen. Many are because we have a strong sense that humanity must come to understand the Nazis as well as the Jews and Gypsies and other victims if we are to adequately face our post-Holocaust world. Ultimately, we will want insight into all the roles played in the Holocaust: victims, perpetrators, survivors, bystanders, liberators, rescuers, resistors, and fighters. Today we focused on the victims, whose ashes lie in the soil of Central and Eastern Europe, and whose absence can be eerily felt by anyone journeying across the European continent. Europe is nearly Judenrein, or free of Jews, although not free of anti-Semitism. Most Jews would never choose to live there again. The disabled now seem to be protected, but the Gypsies are still in the role of the persecuted and abused, so our work is not completed. We have learned that these terrible events came about by human design and not by an accident of nature. Happen again. It behooves you and me to see that it does not. One way we can measure how we are doing as a society is to look at how our most vulnerable citizens are treated. How our children, the elderly, mentally ill, differently abled, gays and lesbians, chronically ill, and people of color faring. You tell me. Thanks. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah, this is not real easy for me to answer, but I'll try. The question is, can we give a definition of gypsies and where they came from? Knowledge that we have is that they came out of northern India in the 8th or 9th century, came across the Turkish peninsula and up through the Middle East, ending up in France, Germany, all those countries where they, in some cases, settled in and developed a culture and split into really basically three groups. The Sinti were the German and Central European. The Roma are the ones who are called because so many of them lived in Romania. That was one of their main places and languages. And then the other group were the Laleri, who we find in Spain, Portugal, who are the dancers and the madrigal singers and so forth in Spain and Portugal and the other side of Europe. So those are the three groups. I think that it's a stereotypical definition at this point, since so many gypsies have modernized. If you find them all over Europe, in Great Britain, for instance, and Scandinavian countries, they're well protected, relatively so. And in Scandinavia, particularly, they have developed wonderful programs for them. There's a small population, but the population there thrives. There because they're so well taken care of as a minority there. And also in the UK, Scotland, Ireland, and Britain, in England, they do fairly well and still have their traditional wagons, but have a number of restrictions, such as where they can draw water, where they can park their wagons, how long they can keep their animals in a certain place, and so forth. We do have gypsies in this country. The largest populations are in Texas and Seattle. So that they have organized groups there. They have housing development associations. They have small business collectives and so forth. You can see them in San Francisco. There are of Roma who live in San Francisco, who are fortune tellers and tarot card readers. If you look about you, you will see some, but you have to look a little more closely than usual because they're all over the place in small family groups. Did that answer? Yes.
Are they starting to write down the history?
They have about 3 major historians right now. One, Ian Hancock at the University of Texas, another fellow in Great Britain, and then who are writing the history, and who are actually historians. And then there's a French woman at the University of Quebec, Gabrielle Turnauer, who has put together a bibliography of writings on the Holocaust and Gypsy life, both. So that, and she's at a place called the Frontier Institute, which is a subcategory of the Genocide Studies Institute at my university. So there are only 3, 4, 5 people in the world. When I went to the library to do a major paper, not on the Holocaust, but on Gypsy women in the world, I found about 40 books, and that was combining San Francisco State and Sonoma State's resources. So, and most of them were fictionalized, dramatized, the Gypsy traveler, the Gypsy musician, kind of fictionalized versions of what Gajos or non-Gypsy imagine the Gypsy life is like. So very few of them are actually written by Gypsies themselves. Yes?
I was really surprised by the percentage, 45% of doctors joining the Nazi Party and such a high percentage in the SA and the SF. Do you have anything you can provide insight into that?
I think Jean would like to answer that one. Let me repeat the question. Since we quoted that 45% of the doctors in Germany joined the Nazi Party, and it being the highest number, do we have insight into why that might have been?
Yeah, there's an explanation for this. I'm a product myself of a very regimented medical education veteran, but it's a parallel to human medicine. Very, very regimented curriculum. And you don't argue with your professor. They are the law. Okay. Now, the father of racial hygiene, Alfred Klutz is his name, he was a social Darwinist, which means an individual who believes that you can take the principles of Darwin and to correct society's ills. That's who he was, and he promulgated this doctrine in 1895. And it's very, very idealistic. In fact, he proposed that the Jews should intermarry in because they had something good to give to the German. Now, what happened was the German society, and not only German, but outside of Germany too, Central European society, picked up on this idealistic thing of breeding good to good, and we'll get better. We'll better the human race. And this was in the medical schools. There were racial hygiene societies that you could belong to, the public could belong to. This was a doctrine that infiltrated the school. Now,
Can you get to the point, G?
yeah, I can't do it any faster than this. But I'm getting to it. The average age of these Nazi positions, this 45%, was under 40 years old. They were young, 30, 35. Very few over 45 joined the Nazi Party. That meant they went to school in 1920 and through 1925. This was at the zenith. This was 10 years after Klutz promulgated this. In 1936, Hitler gave Klutz a medal as the father of this whole thing. So they were so indoctrinated into this that when the political situation opened up, supporting this and encouraging them to come in, they fell for it and they went into it. That's the basis of it.
Okay, so in 3 words, I would say indoctrination. As a summary, indoctrination.
Very well indoctrinated in school.
A predilection towards authority and wanting to take authority roles on myself. And we see this even today. I can speak of this in the professions. Yes, Abby. That's a tricky question nowadays because so many gypsies are a part of just regular secular culture. But what mythological and religious leanings they have tend to be Hindu. They have a number of Hindu, it's matriarchal, and they have goddesses. But many of them, for instance, in Southern Europe, have converted to Catholicism, which they prefer by far to Protestantism. It's difficult to find a Protestant gypsy because being a matriarchal culture, they need merit. They need a saint. They need a woman involved in the hierarchy of gods. And they have a number of traditions that they do, which I can't go into right now, but that relate to, with some translation over many, many years, to Northern Indian Hindu practice. Yes.
I was thinking that many of the victims of the Holocaust and the attempted genocide, their social inadequacies, or what they're called, didn't have anything to do with genetics. I mean, in many cases, physical disability is not a genetic thing, or being a criminal or a prostitute or any of those things. So, do you think that Hitler thought of it as a way of like balancing the budget, or
Well, yes, there definitely was an aspect of economic exigency involved in just wanting to get more resources back away from people that he could see as so vulnerable they couldn't fight back. And you see this in any culture when they're compiling the resources or pulling in resources that the most vulnerable people in society, their programs will be cut first. So that, yes, there is that aspect of it. But I do think that there was a definite appeal during that time to this strange blend and unscientific blend of racial concepts and scientific and technological concepts, which came together wrong, you could say. In other words, none of them were being used in the way to be studied in a scientific context. Big questions. Yes? The number of what, communists? Oh, feminists. No, we don't. And in fact, I included that because of this book by, if I can think of her name, Coons. What's her first name? I can't think. She's a historian from back east, and she has written a very large book called The Fatherland, which came out in the late 80s. And in that book, she had begun to do research on a tremendous number of unmarked, unmeasured, documented women in German society who protested and disappeared. And I had never realized this. So we don't know. She suggests maybe several thousand, which may not seem like a lot, but a lot of these were women who were in the feminist movement, in the lesbian movement, in some of the political movements, in the arts, and so forth. And if they were outspoken, if there was not a place for them for outspoken independent women, you know, in the Third Reich. You had to be a part of the program or there was no place for you either. So we have names of some of them, of some of the people, and some of them we know were tortured to death by Gestapo, died in jail. Some were in concentration camps, some ended up in death camps, and a good number of the French resistance women who, for instance, have written excellent books on Ravensbrück women's concentration camp were feminists from Paris. And the reason that they organized as well as they did in that camp were because they already had basically affinity groups in France before they went. So that might give you a little idea. I guess that's it. It's time, huh? Thank you.